So we're going to start, as I mentioned, with book 4, The Tragedy of Dido. And before we get there, following on book 2, book 3 continues the account of Aeneas's wanderings and repeats many of Odysseus's adventures that Odysseus had recounted in Homer's Odyssey. So again, the attention seems to be, Virgil's intention seems to be to make Aeneas a new, better Roman version of the Greek hero. So a new hero that replaces the older Greek hero. And then in book 4, as I indicated, contains the tragic love affair between Dido and Aeneas. And this story has left a lasting legacy on the literary tradition. Many, cultural tradition, artistic representations of it abound. Other, let's say, literary recountings of some of the backstory, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where Virgil was so much more influential than today. And to many readers, this is the most memorable and troubling of the books in Virgil's epics. They're not quite sure what to make of it because of the kind of tragic note that's left at the ending. So we'll go through that and try to explore that a bit. So the major, what people find troubling about it, the major interpretive debate, since the epic was written right off the bat, was this question about to what extent should Aeneas's actions be seen in a sympathetic light here? So are we to see the fact that he leaves and lets Dido there to wallow in her grief and ultimately commit suicide? Is that another example of his pietas, his departure as an example of his devotion to his duty and his overcoming of his own, let's say, his own desires, let's say, to follow his passions and stay, and his love affair with Dido? Or are we to see this and the way he treats Dido as cold and cruel, okay, and see it along with other, let's say, critiques of what Rome has imposed upon the world, what Aeneas and Rome have imposed upon other characters, other peoples, in terms of their, let's say, march to their destiny of an imperial rule over these other cultures. So the question of Dido's behavior, so we need to keep a couple things in mind. So there, you can make a case, what I want to stress here is you can make a case both for Dido as innocent, as sympathetic character that we should sympathize with through the pain that she's going through in this episode. And you could also make a case for her as somehow culpable and deceiving herself into thinking that there was more going on here, okay? So on the first side, if we were to see, let's say, sympathize with Dido, the love affair between Dido and Aeneas is planned by Venus and Juno. So she doesn't seem to really have a lot of free will in what happens. She doesn't appear to be a free agent at all in choosing to fall in love with Aeneas or in acting on this passion. So in book 1, Venus sends Cupid to inflame Dido's heart with passion for Aeneas. It's not as though it's self-generated. This is imposed by a goddess from without. And then in book 4, Dido's been fighting against this passion, but begins to weaken, especially at the advice of her sister Anna. And a quote from book 4 there: "These were the words that fanned her sister's fire, turned her doubts to hopes, dissolved her sense of shame." So these, one thing to note too, as I've indicated here, is that these words act in the opposite way to those of the dignified orator of the epic simile that begins the epic in book 1. So on the other side, though, we could ask ourselves, Is Dido, though, entirely innocent? So the first couple points I was making there would be ways of seeing her as somehow innocent, in the sense that it was beyond her control. However, how she interprets the events could be questioned. She had made a vow never to remarry. She allows herself to be persuaded by her sister Anna. And is her first loss of integrity disguising her passion as political necessity, we could ask ourselves. And again, Virgil tells us that the narrator explicitly says that they are not married, when she's, in her mind, thinks that they are, in this act of sex that they undertake during the rainstorm of the hunt. And I think the narrator is kind of saying that, they're not married, but she tries to tell herself that they are, to cover over the guilt. So these are the words here from book 4, line 168 to 72. That first day is the source of misfortune and death. Dido is no longer troubled by appearances or reputation. She no longer thinks of a secret affair. She calls it marriage, and with that name disguises her sin. So she's using the name of marriage to disguise a sin. And this seems to be the narrator's judgment, and what, I guess, frames our judgment. Then another note, I guess, kind of on another level, would be to keep in mind what's happening in this episode of Aeneas relating to Dido as parallel to the historical relationship of Mark Antony to Cleopatra, another African queen. So this was the last of the several civil wars that we talked about. This is the civil war between Octavius and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Of course, Octavius eventually won the Battle of Actium, that we'll, as we've mentioned, and we'll see again, and thus initiated, after that victory, a pax romana, a peace with a secure sole rule by Caesar Augustus. This is fairly fresh in Romans' minds when Virgil is writing. This is happening only a couple years before the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE. Virgil starts writing in 29 BCE, so a couple years after. Fresh in Romans' minds is this affair that Mark Antony has with an African queen that seems to many Romans to have, let's say, led him astray from his Roman duty, had threatened, let's say, the security of the Roman people, and especially from this perspective of the epic as written, let's say, as celebrating Augustan rule and celebrating the order brought about by Augustus, we can see Aeneas' relationship with Dido as a potentially similar mistake to what Mark Antony committed with Cleopatra. Mark Antony went all the way and never did, let's say, respond to the call of duty. Aeneas is tempted by that, just as Mark Antony was, but ultimately withdraws, ultimately at the call of Mercury, who reminds him of his duty, says, no, I've got to go found a new Trojan people on the shores of Italy. So this episode would color if you're a Roman reading at the time Virgil's writing, would color your reading of the Dido episode. You're not seeing this as some, let's say, innocent love affair and Dido as an innocent character. You're seeing Dido as a very close analog to Cleopatra, who, along with Mark Antony, threatened the security of the Roman people and had to be, let's say, overcome for Augustus to be able to secure and to institute a peaceful imperial order. So, and then again, on the other side, can Dido be considered blameworthy? We could, as I said, we could, maybe she's not entirely innocent, but it's difficult to find her blameworthy. Her passion is imposed upon her externally by Venus, as we said. Can be argued that as a queen, she has a duty to remarry and to provide an heir. And, remarrying is not a crime, even though she has vowed not to marry again after her first husband, Zacchaeus. But it's a broken vow, but not a crime. So is her punishment in the end, committing suicide and this kind of, well, the fate of her city, Carthage, being destroyed by Rome eventually, is that excessive? And then on the other side, what of Aeneas's cold response? So if you read book 4, I'd be interested to hear your take on it, in maybe in the discussion forum, what have you, when it comes time, whether for the assignment for this, for Virgil's Aeneid, which is due don't quote me on the date, but is due soon. So potentially in the discussion forum, you can let me know your thoughts when reading this. Are we to be sympathetic with Aeneas's response to Dido's suffering? So maybe Dido's not innocent. Maybe we don't see this as entirely a pure operation on her side. However, she's genuinely suffering. She has fallen in love with Aeneas. And is his response cold? Well, one way of looking at it is his response to Dido is to claim a couple of things. First of all, it's not really, again, it's not a matter of his will. And he told her right up front that he had to go, he couldn't stay, that part of his destiny is to found this new line of the Roman, the Trojan people in Italy. And it's not as though he decided, his own free will. He was prompted by Mercury, the god, and reminded of this destiny. And again, this apparent coldness could be seen, his response to Dido could be seen as an example of his, let's say, pietas, his piety, his devotion to duty over and against furor, in this case, in the sense of sexual passion. So maybe at this point, what we'll do is call up those lines here from book. This is book 4. I think I've accidentally put book 2 there, but we'll call up these lines from book 4. Okay, so Aeneas is justifying himself to Dido, and they're having a bit of a heated exchange. She had spoken. He set his gaze firmly on Jupiter's warnings and hid his pains steadfastly in his heart. So remember this theme again of because he's devoted to duty, and a public duty, often he has to, say, squelch the personal, the private, any personal, let's say, feelings that he has. So he has this kind of pain steadfastly in his heart. And he replies briefly at last, "O Queen, I will never deny that you deserve the most that can be spelt out in speech, nor will I regret my thoughts of you, Alyssa." That's another name for Dido. "While memory itself is mine and breath controls these limbs, I'll speak about the reality a little. I did not expect to conceal my departure by stealth. Don't think that. Nor have I ever held the marriage torch or entered into that pact." So he's reminding her, no, we didn't get married. We had a fling, I guess, he would say, but we never held the marriage torch. We never performed a ceremony that bound us together. If the fates had allowed me to live my life under my own auspices and attend to my own concerns as I wished, I should first have cared for the city of Troy and the sweet relics of my family. Priam's high roofs would remain, and I'd have recreated Pergama, so that's a second Troy, with my own hands for the defeated. So if I had my way, he's saying, like if it had been up to me, I'd be with my first wife, right? I'd be there with Troy. This isn't in my control. I've been led down this path by the gods. But now it is Italy that Apollo of Gurnium, Italy that the Lycian oracles order me to take. That is my desire. That is my country. If the turrets of Carthage and the site of your Libyan city occupy you, a Phoenician, why then begrudge the Trojans their settling of Ausonia's lands? So Ausonia, another word for Italy. So just as Carthage and is to her so important, is her home, is her let's say destiny to rule that, and it's a colony of Phoenicia, so too will these Italian lands be, a new Troy for the Trojans, and don't begrudge them that. It is right for us too to search out a foreign kingdom. As often as night cloaks the earth with dew-wet shadows, as often as the burning constellations rise, the troubled image of my father Anchises warns and terrifies me in dream. About my son Ascanius and the wrong to so dear a person, whom I cheat of a Hesperian kingdom and predestined fields. Now even the messenger of the gods, sent by Jupiter himself, so that's Mercury again, who is sent by Jupiter, I swear it on both our heads, has brought the command on the swift breeze. I saw the god himself in broad daylight enter the city, and these very ears drank of his words. Stop rousing yourself and me with your complaints. I do not take course for Italy of my own free will. So ultimately, this reminder, again, this was not my choice. This is a destiny. I was reminded by the gods just recently that I've been kind of neglecting that duty. So we'll go back to our PowerPoint presentation now. And so this is Aeneas's, let's say, justification. And we can see with this description, perhaps Aeneas's position as pitiable as well. Dido obviously is suffering. Aeneas is seemingly suffering as well. And the words of the narrator are showing that, he's suffering, but is keeping it bottled up, so to speak, and it's all internal. And he's, it's the reminder that he's acting against his will, that a lot of his own personal desires have to be, let's say, suppressed in order to meet these public obligations that he has. And also there's the sense that depending on how we interpret one ambiguous line, maybe Aeneas is weeping as well. Okay, so it's an ambiguous line there. So again, question, and we can go either way on this, to what extent the response is overly cold or or we're meant to sympathize with Aeneas and Aeneas's actions. So we looked at Aeneas's justification, and then, and as we said, there's a lot of arguments we can make to justify Aeneas's response. Yet we could also look at some of these lines and say, well, this is pretty cold response. So, so I'm referring here to 4:12 to 49. Dido is in torrents of grief. She sends Anna. Aeneas is with his men getting the ships ready to go. She sends Anna, her sister, to go and plead with Aeneas once more not to go. He hears these words from Anna about the torment that Dido's going through, and his response is, well, the narrator mentions heaven blocks his gentle human ears. So he's kind of closed off to this and reacts somewhat coldly. And here are the lines, some more lines. But he was not moved by tears and listened to no words receptively. Fate barred the way, and God sealed the hero's gentle hearing. As when northerly blasts from the Alps, blowing here and there, vie together to uproot an oak tree, tough with the strength of years, there's a creak, and the trunk quivers, and the topmost leaves strew the ground. But it clings to the rocks, and its roots stretch as far down to Tartarus as its crown does towards the heavens. So the hero was buffeted by endless pleas from this side and that, and felt the pain in his noble heart. His purpose remained fixed. Tears fell uselessly. So this is the ambiguous line, are the tears Aeneas's tears that are falling uselessly? Or most people would say these the tears of Anna and Dido. They're falling, but they're falling uselessly because they're not moving Aeneas, who's fixed like this oak in the epic simile that's being buffeted by winds but stays firm. Note too, in this simile, the oak tree, it stands firm by being rooted in darkness, so to speak. So it stretches to the heavens. So think of in this simile, Aeneas is like an oak tree, and an oak tree, Aeneas, like an oak tree, reaches to the heavens, reaches to the highest aspirations of duty and piety to the gods, but is only able to do that because of these firm roots that reach just as deeply into Tartarus, into the underworld and that which is dark and hidden. So we see, let's say, the two dimensions that makes a hero like Aeneas tick in this simile itself. It's not all roses and sunshine. It takes a certain dark resolve. It means being rooted in darkness itself, so to speak, and that can mean sometimes being cold to others. That can mean being, let's say, brutal and ruthless to enemies, such as Turnus, perhaps. Those might be ways of interpreting this simile and what Virgil's really saying about, well, what it means to be heroic, what it means for Rome to achieve its destiny. Like, its destiny is going to be to achieve a lot of these great and noble things, but it's going to have to be rooted in violence and maybe ruthless behavior towards these other powers that it's going to have to conquer. So the Dido story is maybe our first main example of what I've called the cost of Rome. Remember, the burden of Rome, the molus of Rome. And for those that Aeneas comes across, and the people who must get out of the way so that Rome can come into being. So she kills herself out of anger and shame at Aeneas's actions. She also calls down a curse on Aeneas and his descendants, hoping for an avenger to arise from her ashes. And this, I would say, clearly refers to the historical enmity between Rome and Carthage, and probably specifically to Hannibal and the Second Punic War that we mentioned when we were talking in the second lecture about the historical background of the epic. I think the Roman audience is meant to some extent to pity Dido and the fate of Carthage, but at the same time, remember, she's also parallel to Cleopatra, so it's a complex, let's say, complex relationship we have with Dido. I think there's both happening. So I think we're meant to fear what she represents, in as much as she represents a danger to the destiny and the duty of Rome, just as Cleopatra was that danger. But her suffering and her treatment, the treatment of her city, the ultimate treatment of her city, how the city was destroyed in the Third Punic War, absolutely razed to the ground in the Third Punic War, is so similar to the haunting depiction of the fate of Troy in book that was recounted in Book 2. And we obviously have sympathy for those Trojans, and the haunting tale that of those Trojans that was just depicted so recently in the epic itself. We can't help but think of the similar fate that Carthage is about to undergo. And we have in book 4 as well here these lines, Dido's killed herself, and the women are weeping, for all the world as if enemies stormed the walls, and all of Carthage or old Tyre were toppling down, and flames in their fury, wave on mounting wave, were billowing over the roofs of men and gods. So they were wailing, these women were wailing and crying as if the walls were coming down, as if as if the walls, just as Troy's walls were coming down, as described in book 2 earlier, but also, as we know, the audience, Aeneas doesn't know and Dido doesn't know, but as we know, will be the ultimate fate of Carthage at the hands of the Romans. So I think we're meant to sympathize with that aspect of Dido.